Hello and welcome to the IEA's YouTube channel. I'm Andy Mayer, I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the IEA and Chief Energy Analyst. Today I am joined by Sam Ashworth-Hayes, who has recently written a piece for Spectator that he'll shortly be explaining, and Bruno Prior, who is a trustee of the IEA and a director of Summerleaze Ltd. Both are practitioners as well as thinkers on climate and energy issues. Bruno's company started in mineral extraction and has evolved into investments in waste management and renewables. Sam did something very exciting. He did a startup which uses satellite imagery to help with developing green buildings. Is that correct, Sam?
Yeah, it sort of measures biodiversity in the region.
Excellent. Okay, so let's kick off. We'll get straight into it. Your article was entitled "What Conservatives Should Think About Climate Change," or rather, climate change isn't.
Well, they should care about it, effectively.
Yeah, why should they care?
Well, there's nothing very conservative about it. It is essentially the very short version. There are sort of two strands of argument you can run with here, and I guess I primarily am the first, which is the more emotive one, which is the clue is rather in the name. To be a conservative is to conserve. It's to pass something on to the next generation, and that's to care about our inheritance. And I think our inheritance is a particular culture and legal system, a particular sort of style of economic thinking and governance, and it's also our wonderful green and pleasant land. And you know, this has changed over time. If you go back 125,000 years, you'll find lions and hippopotamuses roaming around the Thames, which are thankfully no longer there. But I think we want to preserve what we have, which is a genuinely special piece of territory, in my point of view.
Well, let me come in there, because we don't have hippopotamuses at the IEA, but we do have a lion. So, Bruno, your response to Sam's article was particularly robust.
Yes, maybe more robust than it deserves, but I admire a lot of what Sam writes. I just didn't particularly agree with some of that article. I didn't disagree with it as some did on the basis that conservatives can somehow ignore climate change. I agree with you entirely that conservatives have to consider what it means to be conservative in an era where climate change is an issue. I disagreed because largely in the last section of the article, as I put in my tweet, where you proposed a shopping list of things that government ought to do. And it seems to me that is moving away from a traditional sense of values and ideas, conservative values and ideas, where you wouldn't expect the government to be saying, here's my shopping list, these are things we should do to respond to it. You would expect the government to create an environment in which individuals would address these things, and there would be an institutional framework within which they were incentivized to do it. Now, I suspect maybe that wasn't what you meant, and we were discussing beforehand, and maybe we'll agree that it wasn't intended as a shopping list, or was it intended as a shopping list?
So my point of view of these things is generally, if you want something done, you set up the incentives and then you step back and let the market do it. So I have a horrible feeling we've got 5 minutes into this debate and we're about to start agreeing with each other for the remaining 40. But I do, I think the section we're referring to refers to sort of nuclear power and tiling the landscape with wind farms, I think I called it, which I thought was maybe slightly more Boris Johnsonian turn of phrase than I possibly should have used. But I do genuinely think we want to decarbonise our energy supply because, well, of course you do. That's how one addresses climate change. And there are mechanisms for which I would prefer to this and mechanisms for which I would not. I very much like carbon pricing. I very much like cap and trade. I'm not such a big fan of sort of zero emission mandates, although I did recently read a very interesting paper actually, which made the point that once you take into account operating costs, these three policies basically come out the same.
I mean, it's interesting you raised carbon pricing because Bruno also referenced that in his tweet thread. And you made, I think, a very interesting point about the level of carbon prices to meet the 2050 target.
Yeah, well, certainly I think the pricing is where it gets really interesting. But actually, step away from it to get to pricing. Let's look at the alternative, which tends to be quotas. Net zero is a quota, right? And the concept of, as a lot of people have felt, I think, judging by Twitter, if Twitter's the real world, in response to yours, that it's all very well to say that the UK has to take a lead. Actually, we've taken a big lead, and one of the problems with this concept is that we ought to go at the same pace as everyone else. I agree with the critique a little bit, but actually the problem with that is, what is the right pace for everyone? How do we decide? If we all said we should reduce our carbon emissions by 20% by 2030, Is that the efficient amount? I'm actually very sceptical it is. It may well be more efficient for us to do 10% and someone else to do 30% or vice versa. So, and that is the fundamental problem with quotas. How do you get rational quotas? I don't think there is any way of getting a set of metrics that would take you to, well, we've all worked out and we all accept this is fair. And we've seen the politics of this over decades, that you can't get there. And if you do, people will default all the time. Just thinking about defaulting, defecting, you brought up the prisoner's dilemma in your article, and I think that's actually a really weak point in that. Because what the prisoner's dilemma teaches you is, iterative prisoner's dilemma, it happens repeatedly. If you can trust someone else not to defect, to cooperate, then it's a reasonable strategy to cooperate. The trouble is, they've been defecting continuously. We're ahead. And if you're in, again, prisoner's dilemma where the other lot are defecting continuously, the worst strategy is to keep cooperating, actually. So
I will raise, there are sort of repeated iterative games which have this sort of cooperate defect mechanism, which aren't quite as bad as Prisoner's Dilemma, and thankfully I think we may be able to get away from that. But we are making some progress on getting people to commit in legislation, and at least move in the right direction, even if not so much we would like to see so. I believe somewhere around 90% of global GDP and 65% of global emissions are now covered by some form of net zero targets. Which they may not.
Could I interject? I mean, isn't that simply the pledges fallacy?
Yeah.
That you've got a lot of promises being made by governments of various qualities in terms of their commitment to those pledges, and those are being then used to overclaim to what is actually happening.
So there's an interesting sort of point here, because if you then turn around and say, well, it's just pledges, therefore we don't need to act, you then almost guarantee by that they are just pledges and that other people won't go through with it. I think once you have just signed up to these things, which people have just done over the last 5-6 months in many cases, you do have to effectively cooperate in the first period and see what happens from there. The reason for the 2050 targets, I think, is fairly straightforward. It's that collectively, as a sort of a global community, which is a terrible phrase I don't really like, but I can't think of a better one off the top of my head. As a global community, that is a point at which you really need to sort of, if not reach net zero, be quite close to it to limit sort of catastrophic warming, which probably would work out significantly in our favour economically if we could do so.
But just to be clear, do you believe the world should achieve net zero by 2050, or are you satisfied with merely the UK doing it?
No, well, so the UK is a tiny fraction of global emissions. We're something about 1%, 1.5?
Just under 1.
Yeah. And 50% of emissions are India, China and USA alone. So realistically, it's that trio which needs to do a lot. But the sort of problem is, if they go out and achieve net zero and the rest of us don't, then you cut emissions in half rather than the sort of full amount you need to reduce them by. So there is a...
Do you believe net zero by 2050 is in any way possible or plausible?
Technically possible, yes. Economically possible, yes. Politically possible, possibly. I think it's a good thing to aim for. We'll see how it plays out. I guess basically primarily we're looking to see what the Americans and the Chinese do.
One of the problems with 2050, or net zero in 2050, is it has a great political virtue, which is way beyond the period that the politicians care about, and therefore it's not a binding commitment that they have to worry about. So I think there are lots of reasons why it's actually wrong, that Lord knows whether zero in 2050 is the right level at the right time, and I don't think anyone else does. But anyway, I don't think we should get bogged down in 2050, because actually, you'll probably agree, Sam, as someone obviously very committed environmentalist, what matters in the next 10 years matters a lot more than what happens in 2050, that actually a lot of stuff gets locked in. It is already locked in, and the more time we put things off to 2050, the more they get locked in. So the question is, what actually how should we be dealing with this now? What's the right way to deal with it? And so going back to quotas, it's very difficult to know. China, I think, took 2070, actually, not 2050. Is that the right number? I don't know. But it's very hard to work out how you find a number that everyone will agree on. But perhaps if you say, well, we all can agree we want the cheapest. It doesn't matter whether the cheapest is in France or China or Thailand. We just want to do it the cheapest way, because in sum, we're all best off. What's the best way of arriving at that? It is to price it, not to do quotas, I think. And one of the interesting things that then comes into prices, another factor is, do we know that zero is the right amount, or might it be an idea that for a while we're adapting and we're above zero? Well, pricing allows you to try and reach that balance as well. So I think, but then we're agreeing vehemently because you also advocate price.
It's an interesting thing is that we don't really have a good mechanism. I mean, obviously you have the European carbon trading scheme, which at least that's soon amended. But we don't sort of have a sort of very good way of shifting these allocations across countries at the moment, and certainly sort of verifying that the reductions which you're paying for have been made. So it's kind of the thing which you end up in a lot with in international affairs of there's a very clear first best way of doing this. We probably can't do it. What's the second best? And I think the second best may well be for each country to look and say, well, look, internally, this is how we can best decarbonise. Because otherwise you end up in these horrendous games of sort of verification and sort of allocating money to projects in other countries, which are, particularly when you look at where the low-cost reductions are going to be, possibly not endowed with the sort of legal systems which would enable you to make those investments with confidence.
There's two different ways of coming out. One is there are actually, carbon dividends includes a concept where you don't have to have global agreement, you have a border carbon adjustment, and therefore one country could go it alone. Maybe more interesting is, does it matter? Is that the right way to do it? Or actually, let's say we take your point. We went second best, and second best is the government working out what ought to happen and making it happen. Is that a price that's worth paying compared to trying to make the first best work in a messy way? So with 30 years of doing renewables, energy policy has always been hopeless in that period. And it's not because they weren't trying. Actually, from 1990, they were trying. The UK was trying more than most countries. It's that as soon as you get people in government who think they know what ought to happen, you get policies that try and make those things happen, which have all sorts of perverse consequences that greatly outweigh any benefit of it. I could give a very long, boring history of the different mechanisms from the non-fossil fuel obligation onwards, where every single one of them had perverse consequences. In general, what they do is try and make certain things that the great and the good think ought to happen. The great and the good have never done anything real in their lives. They don't actually know what ought to happen. And it excludes the possibility of all the other things that people might want to innovate, but can't, because all there is a mechanism to deliver the things that they thought ought to happen.
So just throw an example. I mean, the government has 600,000 heat pumps a year into British homes by 2028 as a target. Is that the sort of thing they should be doing?
I mean, I actually came with a list of sort of vaguely free market policies which I would like to see, because I think there's a way of doing this effectively through fairly significant deregulation in many cases. Mm-hmm. Nuclear power is far more expensive than it needs to be. Mm-hmm. This is particularly the case in the United States, but it's also the case here. We don't build more energy efficient homes or cities even, because density is basically forbidden. Your planning system basically prevents you from doing that. I think there are a number of ways you could push ahead decarbonising the economy through deregulation, which would be sort of very compatible with free markets. And it's that old thing of, you get hopelessly lost, you turn to a local and you say, like, how do I get from here to there? And the guy goes, well, I wouldn't start from where you're standing. If you want to look at the UK energy market and say, look, how do we get from here to net zero or something approaching net zero, you wouldn't start with the last 20 years of policy, I'm pretty sure. But it is where we are. We have completely messed up the markets. And we now sort of have to deal with the consequences of that, the commitments we've made, the contractual obligations we now have in trying to find a way out of it. I don't think any of us would sort of. I remember looking back in 2015 when I was doing a project on this, and sort of coming to the conclusion, oh my goodness, I'm pretty sure it's basically uneconomic to generate any form of electricity without some form of subsidy now. And you end up with this sort of this very distorted market which isn't functioning well. So on this we all kind of agree. It's how we get from here to where we want to go.
But shouldn't that be, so the idea of, well, now we should try and work out which ones those bad mechanisms have not delivered enough of and try and deliver them, is a bit like trying to even up the table by cutting off bits more of the leg, and it stays uneven until you've got no table, you've just got a board. Isn't the answer, you've just given the answer yourself, that you have to not carry on doing the things which were all winner picking. That's why the policy was bad, they were all winner picking. You've got to stop picking winners, you've got to deregulate, as you say. But I mean, for instance, you mentioned storage in your article. Yes. Storage will not happen anywhere near the quantity that allows it to smooth the things that like your landscape tiled with wind farms would need. I think it's pretty certain that won't happen anywhere near that quantity without a lot of subsidy.
Well, I think there's
so should we subsidise that, or should we deregulate and see how much we get?
So there's an interesting couple of points here, because I think you do sort of keep sort of referring to quotas, whereas I think if you were to ask me to design from scratch, and I'm not an energy economist, I'm an economist broadly, and so I think in a certain way, and I hope they would think broadly the same thing. If you asked me to get to net zero by 2050, you would simply set a price for the path for the carbon price, which would get you there, and then leave to that.
How do you know it would get you there? I think the great virtue, and I actually argue with quite a lot of people who are very close to me otherwise, the great virtue of carbon pricing is it might not get you there, and that's a good thing.
That's, interesting point of view.
Because it might be efficient to adapt to some
extent. You may want some adaptation. I mean, I guess the point is that we're already saying there's going to be a fair amount of adaptation happening with the path we're already on. I don't know if you saw recently there's a report saying basically at current pace, even assuming we kind of meet our targets, I think there's 200,000 homes in Britain which will effectively be below sea level, which is probably not optimal for the people living there. So there will need to be a degree of adaptation. There will be increased spending on flood defences, increased spending on sort of mitigating heat effects. So I suspect that you could probably push it a little way, but yeah.
I'm certain we don't know. And the really important thing is to discover, not plan.
Well, so this is a really interesting point, because you keep saying we don't know, and I think that's entirely true. We don't know. This sort of comes down to, we're both pleading the same case. We're both saying there's a big degree of uncertainty. You're sitting here saying it's very uncertain what's going to happen, therefore we should take this sort of wait and see approach. I'm sitting here saying we're pretty sure the median case is bad. There's all these tail risks over here which are really bad, so we should be taking a much more aggressive approach.
I'm certainly not saying wait and see.
Can I get some precision on this? Because I don't think Bruno is saying should just wait and see. He's saying that the price mechanism is a better way of delivering the change that you want to see than the government sitting there saying we will magically transform the energy system with our wonderful technology targets and our friends from these large corporations who suddenly find themselves very popular as sources of government largesse. And you use the expression dirigisme, which is the French state model. Yes, I mean the French state has delivered a nuclear energy company which it has now had to bail out because it is bankrupt due to other policies the French state has introduced, and also the fact that they've gambled successfully in the 20th century on technology to deliver an enviable low-carbon energy system by many standards. But their latest version, the EPR, the one we're investing in at Hinkley Point and Sizewell C, looks like it's a bit of a disaster. It's a bad punt. So is this planning going to work?
I think there's there is a scenario where you can get there in a more efficient way. But I would say as well, the actual amounts we're talking about are not vast. If you take the OBR's forecast, I know you don't like the OBR's forecasts, but if you take them, we're talking about 1.4 trillion of investment by 2050, of which maybe a quarter comes from the government. So that's...
Do you mean the CCC's forecast?
So the CCC, I think, is the total investment, and the OBR, I think, has forecast what they'd actually have to spend. Okay. So the OBR basically assumes about a quarter comes from the government, but there's some offsetting in terms of energy efficiency savings, because that's part of the way of getting there. So I think they believe you end up spending about 344 billion over this period, which, to put it in context, that's 3 years of NHS spending.
But they absolutely don't know. I mean, it's within a wild degree of uncertainty.
But even if you assume it's... so should we take it as double?
No, take it as 10 times maybe.
10 times maybe a little much.
The uncertainty, seriously, for instance, storage is a very good example that people have no concept of how difficult it will be to provide economic storage to deal with the intermittency of wind more than solar. Solar is predictable to a greater extent.
We do have those dark windless days, and I think there's you need to be able to plan for at least 10 in a row, but that's if you want to do that through battery lithium, that's inordinately expensive right now. So you do have other mechanisms of storage, which may be less energy efficient, which I think
might
is
be still burning some stuff.
Possibly still
just on that marginal bit, it might be worth taking the cost of that rather than going for zero.
But this is, you still come out at net zero because this is the Dieter Helm model. So Dieter, I believe, and my apologies if I got this horribly wrong, Dieter, I believe, has referred to using combined cycle gas turbines still well out to 2050 and combine this with carbon sequestration and storage. I think I sort of briefly mentioned this in passing, that it may well be that one of the ways you reach net zero is by basically just offering up a price per unit of carbon abated.
Should the government care about this at all? Shouldn't it just be saying the carbon price is this? If you think that carbon price is attractive for your technology, please do bid. I mean, do we favour the current system for deployment of principally renewable energy, the CFD system?
No, absolutely
Okay,
not.
so what's wrong with that as a mechanism?
I mean, I just mentioned sort of offering a bounty effectively per unit of carbon removed would be an option, which I think is pretty technology agnostic.
Yeah.
And you could combine.
For our listeners, what's the difference?
So the difference effectively is, rather than basically offering up a sort of guaranteed contract for these certain technologies already out there, and saying to this wind farm, like, we'll pay you this much above the rate, the going rate, or in the case of is it Sizewell, which was getting the inordinately large...
the regulated asset-based subsidies in advance.
Yep, we're getting you're basically locking these very high unit price of electricity in advance, although actually, given the current gas prices, they're coming out as moderately economic. So thank you, Vladimir, for doing your bit for net zero. The difference is effectively, if you just pay out per unit of carbon abated, or per unit of carbon taken out of the atmosphere, or if you even just charge them per unit of carbon emitted, you end up with this much more efficient model across the entire economy, where basically where it's cheap and easy to cut, you cut; where it's not cheap and easy to cut, you buy from someone else, or you abate, or you or you pay for someone else to abate, or you capture it. So I think that's basically the way any economist would prefer to design the system, and I don't...
Is that correct?
I'm very... I mean, it ought to be just a part of carbon pricing, yes. And I'm very happy that carbon capture would be one of the things that got a carbon price. That seems fair. Again, with all due respect to Dieter, who's probably the most expert on this, I don't think even Dieter himself knows what the true costs of those will be again. And that's why I just want it to be a price-based, and I think he does actually, want it to be a price-based mechanism. I don't think he's saying that he's expert, I think he's holding out scenarios that show that quite likely in a price-based model we'll get somewhere near it.
So just to interrupt, when I do sort of list these things off, saying, run gas and do that, I'm not saying this because I want to pick winners. I'm saying this is a plausible path which you might see emerge under this pathway. Yeah. Which again was what I was trying to do in that Spectator article, was saying I'm very in favour of building wind turbines if they are economic to do so, and we certainly shouldn't be basically blocking them through NIMBYism.
There's a very interesting thing there. So this is completely separate departure. I mean, in a sense, we're agreeing quite strongly at that point. Your article was about conservatism and climate change. There are other elements of conservatism, and I think a lot of conservatives, little or big C, might be hostile to that concept of paving the land with windmills. How do you square from within your philosophy the different aspects of conservatism that if local people just didn't want that, I think you're saying near enough they should have to have it, are you?
So hyperbole aside, because I think it was a slightly deliberately provocative phrasing, which did work, as evidenced by the fact we're having a debate. It sort of comes down to the same point we have everywhere, really, in that there is a sort of this NIMBY-ish instinct that nothing should ever change in my particular neighbourhood, whether that's building new housing, building new roads, building wind turbines. Infamously, in the case of one cottage, building an interconnector which would have significantly helped that electricity supply. I don't know if you saw about this, Penny Mordaunt, I believe, helped block it. I think you can still be a conservative effectively and say that actually, for the good of the country as a whole, there needs to be slightly fewer vetoes on the free market planning system.
Well, it's a view that many people who support the views of the IA would agree with.
And
I think so, but whether that's conservative, I don't know. I mean, we probably would agree with that, but it sounds very liberal to me. That.
Well, if you want to be more conservative about it in the terms of allowing people to make these decisions, you could basically put in mechanisms for what would fundamentally amount to some sort of bribery, whereby if you're going to build a big wind turbine with big externality, you offset some of the costs to the local because they have an alienable property rights.
This is a Cosian solution. Why is there any need? Why doesn't that just happen? Why wouldn't wind farms go to the local council and say, "We'll pay you X% of our profit"?
This is actually a really interesting question because it seems to be absent across a whole range of the British economy. Like you don't find housing developers generally saying, "Okay, fine, we're going to be building a street next to you. It's going to be a pain. Here's a couple of grand."
Actually, you do, because it's obliged by the planning system, massively.
One example where it has been built in is the proposed regime for fracking, where there is both a £100,000 payment and a 1% community levy, which everybody's expecting to be driven up as part of the compromise solution on re-enabling it. I mean, should that just not be applied across the board to all forms of energy generation?
I mean, I think more broadly, if you want to fix the British planning system, then having a sort of more ways of making transfer payments would be quite useful. So,
But yeah, in I forget which section it is, but there's a section zoning agreement which pretty much all significant housing developments are bound by, which does exactly that. It puts money back into the community for local roads and things like that.
So sorry, there's the difference between putting things in the local community and then just saying to someone, here's a couple of grand, go spend it.
But it's not from the developer's point of view, it's just more money. Right? So I think you're saying it's just not enough going from developments to local communities to overcome the reticence. But what if there is no balancing amount? What if the amount the community wants for these things is more than the amount that a developer can justify?
I suspect people's willingness, willingness to accept is generally higher than willingness to pay, but I suspect that in most of these cases you would actually be able to pick people off quite easily.
It'd be good to find out.
It would be good to find out. The worst case scenario is you introduce a way for making side payments for projects which would have great economic value, and it turns out it basically doesn't do anything because you've even though you've made these rights alienable, they're still too strong, in which case you just turn around and say, okay, we're going to weaken the number of vetoes in the planning system, which I still think would be a very good idea. And if it does work, then fantastic, you've just found a way of making sort of win-win solutions.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah.
Okay, so you both agree with each other now. You've got to a consensus position on a conservative free market approach.
But I don't think it's very conservative. I agree with it completely. I just don't think it's very conservative. If you look at it, it almost defines Britain, this devotion to keep. Well, I mean, you talked about it yourself. You want to still be playing cricket. What if they want to build the wind farm on your cricket pitch?
There are a good number of cricket pitches.
Yeah, even more golf courses.
Exactly. Also, the nice thing about cricket pitches is they have to be flat, and so the sort of hilly terrain suited to wind farms would be.
If you want to put a lot of wind farms up, they're going to be everywhere.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
So, I think we agreed that Britain's cricket pitches are safe, come what may. You've come to some sense of agreement that the approach is one that could be rooted in conservative philosophy, with a strong dose of liberal free market economics to actually make it work. So where do you actually disagree then, if anywhere?
I'll ask you one thing, Sam. It's maybe, I don't know if you want to just, the thing about people over the age of 57, so you say, well, do you want to, that just isn't a reasonable point. You hear it a lot. It's not just picking on you, but younger people tend to make this a lot, that the reason that older people tend to be sceptical about some of the more grandiose climate plans is because they'll be dead soon. And that is absolutely unreasonable, I'm afraid. That isn't how they're looking at it.
I believe that was actually raised by one of the MPs who was talking about the membership in the Conservative Party. I would go further. I would say this is basically present across almost every field of policy. If you look at planning reform, it's the preservation of sort of older people's property prices is the priority. If you look at pensions, they're very happy to vote themselves increases out of increasingly low working people's wages. If you look at climate change, they're happy to offload costs onto future generations. I think, unfortunately, we have a somewhat self-interested sort of set of older generations who are quite happy to push costs downwards, as evidenced by the way they will keep voting to do so. That has been effectively the trend in British government for the last 10 years or so. And I think the idea that you turn around and say, well, if you sort of have a sort of agent, which, in one of these multi-generational agency games where they sort of don't discount the future very heavily, I think unfortunately do discount people.
Would you say there's much more to do with the government repetitively failing to understand the behavioural economics around home improvement fundamentally? I mean, it is an age thing. I mean, if you're approaching your last years, spending vast amounts of money on your house, which you're not going to enjoy the benefits of, is a rational decision. But also being told by the man from the ministry that you should install this lovely heat pump when they came around 10 years ago and said you need cavity wall insulation, which also turned out to be a rather over-promised and under-delivered project. Aren't the elderly simply being rational economic actors in this circumstance?
But this is exactly it. They're taking the decision from their point of view, what's the cost and benefit to me? And that's most of the decision, which is exactly what I just said.
I really don't think it is. With regard to climate change, I think you'll find people, on the whole, hold their view from the perspective of what do I think is going to be the interests of not just me, but everyone that I care for. They just have a different view to you about what the risks and probabilities are. They've been around a long time. They were probably around in '76 and think we've been hot before, and they look at other countries and see that they've coped with heat, and they are more inclined to take a moderate view of of how we would go about this rather than an extremist view.
So this is really interesting, actually, because I mean, we have had hot periods before, but I think it's worth noting the 10 hottest years in British history have been in the last 20. So there's definitely an upwards trend, and it is getting somewhat worse. But this, having sort of lived overseas and see how they do it, well, I lived in Australia for 4 years, which is a wonderful country, but you'll know that I am back here now. And it's, I would suggest, given the way British housing stock is and the way sort of British society has organised itself, that sort of temperatures sort of 4 or 5 degrees higher than the ones we currently have would be not optimal.
I haven't looked into it. I would guess that average temperatures in America are of that order, warmer than us, and they seem to do fairly well.
The Americans have a substantially higher income than we do, of course, as well, which,
Maybe that's because they approach things from a better policy perspective.
But Spain doesn't, and they're much warmer than we are.
Spain's much more than really. They're culturally quite different as well. But I mean, it's not. We're not sort of saying. I'm not sort of sitting here and saying, if we're 5 degrees warmer, it's an absolute catastrophe. It's the end of the world. I am saying that Britain isn't Spain, and I'm not particularly sure we want it to be. Either in sort of in the countryside or in the environment, or even particularly culturally.
All those vineyards will be a problem.
I'm going to take a stand here, which may be somewhat unpopular, and I may completely lose what tiny fraction of the audience I have left with me. But I actually quite like England's weather. I like the sort of the damp, the green. There is a place for sort of heat and dry grass, and it's where we go on holiday.
And it helps solve your elderly problem, given that the cold kills 75 times more people than heat.
I mean, look, the Treasury, I'm sure, is counting that in when it makes its predictions. But
yeah.
I think that's a very good place to start wrapping up. Bruno, you have any final remarks for Sam?
No, I mean, I think on that last point, just going back to the point about what the elderly think about things, but do you see that there are other perspectives? You like
No,
that. In fact, probably most of the elderly agree with you that they would rather like our climate, but you could take a different view, and that they're more likely holding their view because they've weighed things differently to you than because they just don't care about anyone but themselves.
Look, they're not caring about anyone themselves is a provocative way of phrasing it, but I do think basically they have very strong economic incentives to behave a certain way, as many people do, and unfortunately it's not terribly well aligned with the interests of future generations.
And on that note, at the IEA, we do care for the elderly as much as anyone else. And if you care about this content and want to see more of it, then please do support our work by subscribing to the IEA Patreon account and reading fundamentally Sam's article to learn more about the issue, and Bruno's tweets to learn what he thought about it. And all that content will be in the show notes afterwards. So thank you very much for listening, and have a happy and prosperous, if possibly warmer, future.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.